She never asked for help. She always worked double shifts without a single complaint. But one night, after the cafeteria had closed, Eva Mitchell did something Keanu Reeves never expected. She asked for food. And when he saw her standing there, hesitant, as if the simple act of asking was the hardest thing she'd ever done, he couldn't ignore it. Keanu Reeves was a man of purpose, focused, driven, and successful. As the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, he had earned every bit of his success. Long hours, missed family events, and countless sacrifices. He built his empire with his own two hands, believing that hard work was the only thing that mattered. To him, the world was simple: you work hard, you get results. And that's exactly what he expected from his employees. No excuses. No complaints. Every person in his company knew their role, and they were expected to give their best, day in and day out. Keanu wasn't interested in the personal lives of his staff. That wasn't his job. He didn't ask about their struggles or the obstacles they faced outside of work. As far as he was concerned, what happened after 5 p.m. didn't matter. The business came first. But somewhere along the way, in the grind of building his empire, Keanu had missed something crucial. His employees, the ones who worked tirelessly, gave everything to the company. They were more than just workers to him. And one night, when he saw Eva Mitchell, a dedicated employee, do something unexpected, it forced him to realize that he'd been overlooking something he couldn't ignore anymore. Eva Mitchell had always been the model employee. She worked double shifts without a word of complaint, always punctual, and always dependable. She was the kind of person you could rely on, quiet, hardworking, and seemingly impervious to the exhaustion that wore down others. But something was different that night. It was late, the office quiet and dim, and Keanu Reeves sat in his glass-walled office, finishing up some final reports. As his eyes drifted toward the cafeteria, something caught his attention: Eva, standing alone at the food counter. The cafeteria was supposed to be closed by now, yet there she was, glancing nervously around before leaning in and asking the kitchen staff for food. It struck Keanu immediately. This wasn't like her. Eva never asked for help. She was always the one who gave. She was the quiet force who handled her work without a second thought, who sacrificed without asking for anything in return. Yet there she was, asking for food like she was trying to hide it from the world. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his curiosity piqued. He watched her accept the takeout container, stuffing it quickly into her oversized bag as if she didn't want anyone to see. She moved quickly, head down, rushing out of the cafeteria without a word, just like she'd done everything else in her life, on her own. But tonight, for the first time, something about her caught Keanu's attention in a way it never had before. Eva, always the reliable worker, was showing him something he hadn't noticed: vulnerability. She wasn't just surviving the grind of double shifts, she was struggling. And now Keanu couldn't shake the image of her, alone in the cafeteria, quietly asking for something she needed but could barely bring herself to ask for. Keanu couldn't shake the image of Eva asking for food. The more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. So, against his usual instinct to stay detached, he decided to follow her. The business of the day had ended, and the building was quiet as he stepped out of his office and into the hall. He kept his distance, watching as Eva exited the building, her steps quick but weary. She didn't walk to her car, because there was no car. Instead, she walked toward the bus stop, the sound of her shoes echoing in the stillness. Keanu's heart sank a little as he realized that Eva, the woman who worked tirelessly, who showed up day after day without fail, didn't even have the luxury of a ride. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her body, the chill of the evening air biting at her skin. The bus stop was empty, and as she waited, Keanu could see the weariness in her posture, the weight of exhaustion heavy in her every movement. Her shoulders slumped slightly, as if the day had already taken everything from her. Keanu stayed across the street, making sure not to draw attention, but his gaze never left her. He watched as she stood there, not rushing, just waiting for the bus, her head slightly down, the long day catching up to her. She wasn't just tired, she was drained, mentally, emotionally, physically. When the bus arrived, Eva climbed aboard, moving with the same tired resignation. Keanu hesitated, feeling that pull to understand more, to know where this was leading. Without thinking, he followed her. The bus ride stretched on, the neon lights flickering over the streets they passed. The further they went, the less familiar Keanu's surroundings became. He was used to the polished streets, the corporate world he'd built, but this was a world he had never truly seen. They passed shopping centers, then the business district, until finally, the buildings grew smaller and older. The neon signs gave way to dim streetlights, and the air grew thicker with the scent of rain and aging buildings. Keanu watched as Eva stepped off at a stop, her pace still quick but heavier now. She walked down a cracked sidewalk, past worn-out buildings, her head slightly down as if trying to keep a low profile. She stopped at a small apartment complex, nothing like the high-rise offices Keanu was used to. This was where she lived. The place looked old, worn out, and yet Eva moved toward it like it was her safe haven. She climbed a narrow staircase, pulling out a set of keys. Keanu stopped just before the entrance, his breath held as he watched her disappear inside. What he saw next shocked him. Through the thin curtains of the window, Keanu could see the bare walls of her apartment. It wasn't the type of bare where someone had just moved in, this was the kind of bare where someone had been living with nothing for far too long. A single mattress on the floor, no furniture, just a few blankets and a plastic crate. The room was cramped, lifeless. And then, the sight that stopped him cold, two small faces peeked out from the side of the mattress. Eva's children. Keanu had heard rumors, but seeing them, seeing the way she'd been living, he hadn't expected this. Eva opened the takeout container, splitting the meal between the two kids, watching them eat as if it was the most precious thing she could give them. She didn't eat. She fed them, and that was enough. Keanu stood frozen in place, the weight of it all hitting him hard. This wasn't just about a hard-working employee, it was about a woman who had been struggling silently, giving everything she had just to make sure her kids had something to eat. Her life was far more complicated than Keanu had ever imagined. Keanu stood across the street, watching Eva as she disappeared into the small apartment complex. He felt a knot in his stomach, something he couldn't shake. He had followed her this far, and now he couldn't stop himself from seeing the truth he had never bothered to uncover before. He took a step closer, staying hidden in the shadows, his mind racing. As he approached the building, he couldn't help but notice how different it was from the sleek, polished offices he ran. The apartment complex was old, the walls cracked, and the windows dimly lit by a single light. The worn-down exterior told a story of hardship, a world far removed from the corporate empire Keanu had spent his life building. Eva's footsteps echoed up the stairs, and Keanu followed, keeping a careful distance. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he knew he had to see it for himself. When she reached the second floor, she fumbled with her keys for a moment before stepping inside. Keanu lingered, his heart pounding in his chest. The apartment was barely visible through the thin curtains. It wasn't just empty, it was barren. The kind of emptiness that told a story of struggle and survival. There was no couch, no table, no sign of comfort or warmth. The walls were bare, the floors cold. A single mattress lay in the center of the room, the only furniture in sight. A couple of folded blankets sat nearby, and a plastic crate stood where a table should have been. Then, as if the scene couldn't hit harder, two small heads peered out from the side of the mattress. Eva's children. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. He had heard whispers of her situation, but seeing it firsthand, it felt like a punch to the gut. Eva didn't sit down to eat, didn't even think of herself. She knelt on the floor, opening the takeout container she had grabbed earlier. The children, no older than 5 or 6, eagerly scooted forward. They devoured their meal, their faces lighting up with the simplest joy. Eva split the meal between them, ensuring they ate first. There was no sign of resentment or frustration on her face, just quiet strength, the kind of strength that came from a mother doing whatever it took to make sure her children were taken care of. Keanu watched in silence, the weight of what he was seeing sinking in deeper with every passing second. The small, bare apartment. The single mattress on the floor. The sacrifices Eva was making every single day for her kids. She wasn't just struggling, she was surviving. The contrast between Eva's life and his own was jarring. He had built his business empire from the ground up, focusing on profits, deadlines, and success. Yet here was a woman, working just as hard, if not harder, for a fraction of what he had. And her struggle wasn't just about working double shifts, it was about survival. Her entire life was a sacrifice, and she had done it all in silence, never once asking for help. Keanu couldn't look away. This was the turning point. The discovery of Eva's reality, the harshness of her world, forced him to face the limitations of his own worldview. He had spent his life pushing for success, believing that hard work alone could fix everything. But now, standing on the edge of Eva's reality, he realized how wrong he had been. This was no longer about business, it was about people. It was about recognizing the lives behind the names on his payroll. Eva's situation shattered the lens through which Keanu had been viewing his employees. And now, for the first time, he was forced to question everything he had built. Keanu stood motionless in the shadows of the building, just beyond Eva's apartment, his breath steady but his mind in turmoil. The cold night air seemed to press down on him, amplifying the weight of what he had just witnessed. Eva's apartment was a stark contrast to the polished glass walls and immaculate offices he had spent years building. The walls in Eva's place weren't adorned with success, they were bare, much like the life she had been forced to live. His thoughts raced as he replayed the scene in his mind. The single mattress on the floor, the empty apartment with no furniture, the children eating the last scraps of food she could get her hands on. The image of her kneeling on the floor, quietly splitting the meal, was seared into his memory. She wasn't just working double shifts, she was living in survival mode. And he had never seen it. Keanu had always believed in the power of hard work, in pushing through, in achieving success no matter what. He had built his empire on that belief. Success was earned, and only the strong survived. That's what he had told himself every day. It had worked for him. It had worked for his business. But as he stood there, the realization began to settle over him like a heavy fog. His company, this empire he'd built, hadn't accounted for the people behind the numbers. He had been so focused on the next big deal, the next step forward, the expansion of his brand, that he had forgotten something fundamental. His employees weren't just assets, they were people, struggling with lives that were far more complicated than anything he could see from his glass-walled office. Eva's quiet strength, her ability to show up every day despite the struggles she faced, was something Keanu had completely overlooked. And now that he had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. His mind kept circling back to the same thought, how could I not know? He had built his success on being a leader who knew everything, nothing escaped his notice. But in this moment, he realized he had been blind. His company wasn't just a machine to generate profits, it was a community of people, all with their own battles and burdens. Eva's struggle wasn't an isolated case. It was a reflection of a larger truth, one that Keanu had been ignoring for far too long. Keanu felt a knot in his stomach, a mixture of guilt and disbelief. His mind raced, filled with questions. How had he gotten so focused on the numbers that he missed the faces behind the data? How had he become so disconnected from the lives of the very people who kept his business running? This moment, this discovery, had shaken him to his core. He couldn't simply go back to his office and pretend it hadn't happened. His perspective had shifted. The business wasn't just about profits anymore, it was about the people who made those profits possible. Keanu's internal conflict grew stronger. He had spent his entire career creating systems, pushing limits, demanding results. But now, looking at Eva's life, he understood that leadership wasn't just about demands, it was about understanding, empathy, and support. He couldn't walk away from this realization. He couldn't go back to the way things were. Eva's struggles had opened his eyes to the need for change. The question now wasn't what would happen to the company, it was what kind of leader he wanted to be. The morning after the night he followed Eva home, Keanu sat at his desk in his office, staring at the screen in front of him without seeing it. His mind replayed the images from the night before, Eva's empty apartment, her children sitting on the floor, eagerly eating the only meal she could provide them. He had spent the entire night turning over the reality of her life in his mind. The discovery had shaken him to his core. He had spent so much of his life focused on growth, profits, and deadlines that he hadn't even seen the human side of his company, the people who were giving their all, often without asking for help, and sometimes without receiving the care they deserved. Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed his employees. How many others were living like Eva? Struggling in silence, trying to make ends meet while pushing themselves to the breaking point for a company that saw them as nothing more than numbers? He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the same reports he had seen a dozen times before, but none of them mattered. The spreadsheets, the figures, the projections, they all felt meaningless now. They no longer held the weight they used to. The weight now belonged to Eva, to the people who were fighting battles outside of the office, yet still showed up every day, giving their best. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. It was time. Time to stop just thinking about change and actually make it happen. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to focus. "Come in," he called, his voice still carrying the weight of the previous night. The door opened, and there she was, Eva Mitchell, looking just as she always did. Polite, quiet, and reserved. She stepped into the room, a hint of hesitation in her posture. She didn't know what Keanu had seen the night before. She didn't know that he had followed her, watched her, and learned more about her struggles than she'd ever let anyone know. Keanu noticed how she stood at the door, waiting for permission to sit, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had the same calm, controlled demeanor she always wore at work. Nothing in her appearance or behavior suggested that the woman standing before him was hiding a mountain of burdens. "Please, have a seat," Keanu said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. He watched her carefully as she took a seat, her eyes focused on the floor, unwilling to make direct eye contact. There was a long silence. Keanu was trying to gather his thoughts, but he knew he couldn't tiptoe around this. There was no time for politeness or small talk. He needed to be direct. "Eva," Keanu began, his voice steady but carrying an unusual weight, "I saw you last night. I followed you home." Her head snapped up at the words, her eyes wide with confusion, then quickly narrowing as if she was trying to process what he had just said. She looked taken aback, a brief flicker of panic flashing across her face. "You followed me?" she asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and concern. Keanu didn't look away. He was calm, firm, and unwavering. "Yes. I saw your apartment. Your kids. I saw everything." He paused, watching her carefully as her face flushed, a look of shock and defensiveness settling in. "I should have known sooner. I should have seen the signs. I should have understood what you were going through." Eva's breath hitched. She was clearly uncomfortable, but she stayed silent, her hands now fidgeting in her lap. She wasn't used to being seen like this, seen for who she really was, beyond her work ethic. It wasn't her fault. She had never asked for sympathy, and now she was suddenly confronted with something she wasn't prepared to face. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with hers. "I've spent my whole career focused on numbers, Eva. On deadlines, profits, and growth. But last night, I realized how much I've missed. How much I've ignored. His voice softened slightly, but the sincerity behind it was clear. Your hard work, your sacrifices, they didn't go unnoticed. But I see now that I've failed to create a space where people like you can thrive, not just survive. Eva swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling with a deep, shaky breath. She wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. She had been surviving, doing everything on her own for so long that she wasn't sure how to react to someone offering help. Especially someone like Keanu Reeves, her CEO, a man she had always seen as distant, focused only on the business side of things. Keanu paused, his eyes never leaving hers. I want to help, Eva. Not just with a one-time handout, but in a way that makes sure you, and everyone else like you, are supported. I'm going to raise wages, provide better hours, child care assistance, and emergency support. He slid a thick envelope across the desk toward her, its contents heavy with promise. This isn't charity. This is an investment, in you, and in everyone who works here. I need your help to make it happen. To make sure no one has to live the way you've been living. Eva looked down at the envelope, her fingers hovering over it, unsure whether to take it or walk out. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her, but there was something in Keanu's eyes, something real, that made her pause. She had spent her whole life taking care of others, never once allowing herself to accept help. This was different. This was real help, not pity. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers grazing the envelope before gripping it tightly. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. She wasn't used to being seen. She wasn't used to someone actually caring. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Why do you care now? Keanu stood up, meeting her gaze with a newfound determination. Because I should have cared sooner. Because I built this company, but I let people fall through the cracks. I refuse to let that happen anymore. Eva nodded, her breath shaky but steady. For the first time in a long time, she felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't just about a company, it was about changing lives. Keanu sat back in his chair, watching Eva closely as she gripped the envelope in her hands. The air between them felt thick, the weight of his decision hanging in the space. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, uncertainty, disbelief, and maybe a bit of fear. This wasn't the kind of offer she was used to. It wasn't charity or a simple gesture of kindness. It was something far more significant. I want to change things here, Eva, Keanu began, his voice steady but filled with an unusual sense of urgency. I've spent my life focusing on business, on growth, on profit margins. But I can't keep ignoring the human side of this company anymore. I can't keep ignoring the people who work so hard and yet struggle in silence, like you. Eva looked up at him, her eyes wide, her expression a mixture of hope and skepticism. She wasn't sure if she could believe what he was saying, but the sincerity in his tone made it hard to ignore. You shouldn't have to struggle this way, Keanu continued, his voice growing firmer. I can't change what's happened in the past, but I can change the future. I want to offer you more than just sympathy, Eva. I want to offer you a real solution. He paused for a moment, letting the gravity of his words settle in, before he leaned forward, pulling out a set of documents from his desk drawer. He placed them in front of her with a gentle but deliberate motion. This isn't just about you, Keanu said. It's about everyone here, the people who give their all every day, but who never seem to catch a break. Starting with you, I want to raise wages for everyone. No one should have to live paycheck to paycheck. I also want to improve the hours, give people the time they need to live their lives outside of work, to be with their families. And I know how hard it is to balance work and family, so we're going to introduce childcare support for those who need it. Eva sat there, stunned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was the CEO, the man who had always been focused on results and profits, now speaking directly to the heart of her struggle. "And there's more," Keanu added, his voice softer now, but no less determined. "I want to put a system in place for emergency assistance, something that helps employees when life throws them a curveball, whether it's a medical emergency, a family crisis, or just a moment when they need a little extra support. I don't want anyone here to feel like they're invisible or alone." Eva's fingers trembled as she held the envelope, her heart racing. The weight of what Keanu was offering hit her all at once. It wasn't just about the financial relief, though that alone would change everything, it was about being seen. For the first time in her life, someone was offering a real solution to the problems she had silently shouldered for so long. "I can't promise that everything will change overnight," Keanu said, his gaze never wavering from hers. "But I can promise this, I will do everything in my power to make sure no one here has to go through what you've been going through. You won't have to do it alone anymore." Eva blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. For so long, she had kept her struggles hidden, trying to do it all on her own. She never expected this kind of compassion from someone like Keanu, someone who had always seemed so far removed from the day-to-day reality of his employees. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if she still couldn't quite believe it. Keanu's expression softened, and he gave a small, almost wistful smile. "Because it's the right thing to do. I've spent too long focused on building a business, but now I see that the true measure of success isn't just profits. It's about the people who make that success possible. I want to build a company where people can thrive, not just survive." Eva's chest tightened, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over her. She had never imagined a world where her struggles were seen, let alone addressed so directly. Slowly, she reached for the envelope and pulled it toward her. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say, but, thank you." Keanu nodded, his expression serious. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that I mean it, Eva. This company is going to be different from now on. For everyone." As Eva stood up, holding the envelope close to her chest, she felt something shift inside her, a spark of hope that had been long buried. Keanu's offer wasn't just a lifeline, it was a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, things could get better.